Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, a membership-based organization. And today's program is our way of giving back to our community. And we're delighted that over 350 people are joining us today. And as John noted, over 400. It just keeps going up, which is exactly what we want. I would like to introduce Chris Madrid-French, our Development and Marketing Director, to tell you more about our upcoming programs.
Hi, thanks, Cindy. I wanted to thank everybody for supporting CPF and for calling in from all over the country. This webinar today is free for everybody, but it is one of the benefits of membership and sponsorship. I'm calling in from Orlando in my 1959 A-frame, designed by architect Clifford Wright. And for all of us, architecture is important. So we are hoping that you will also join us on March 30th, when the three of us will be introducing our slate of new programming. And that'll be next Monday from noon to 1:30. And then you can register now at californiapreservation.org. And John, if you want to go to the next slide. We have a free webinar. Once a month, we're going to be taking one of our recorded webinars from the vault. And the first one we're going to start with will be a fun one showcasing Walt Disney's architecture, including Tiki Modern and Route 66, the relationship with Disney's architecture, and all of the attractions. So you still have a chance to go to Disney here at Orlando and in Los Angeles. The parks are closed, but you can still visit. That'll be free until April 30th. And I'd encourage you to register for that and share that with your friends. And also, just to conclude this, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors who make what we do possible here at CPF. And we would love for all of you to join us. Just click on our website. We're putting up new things every day. Thanks, John. I wanted to introduce John. I'm handing it back to you.
Okay, so my job here is just to give you some very basic background information on how to ask questions for today's program. You'll notice that we have 6 wonderful panelists here logged in today, and you'll be able to see them later as they present their presentations. But they will be speaking for a total of up to 75 minutes. And then we'll close with a 15-minute question and answer period. So each of you will have a chance to ask your questions, but we highly suggest that you type in your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will keep an eye on those and moderate. The earlier you ask the question, the more likely it will be addressed. I address the questions in the order that we receive them. So if you think of a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box right away or the Q&A box, and I'll make sure it's addressed during the 15-minute question and answer period. If any of you would like to ask your question in person, we do have that ability, but you will need to be attached to a microphone or a webcam with a microphone enabled. And if you have those items, you can simply raise your hand by clicking on the raise hand button, and I will try to enable your access to your microphone so that you can ask your question to the panelists in person. If you're unable to do so, you can always ask your question by typing it into the Q&A box or the chat box. But some people prefer to have a discussion or conversation with the speakers or ask detailed questions, and you may want to do that by enabling your microphone. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it directly over to one of our education committee members, and I also want to give a very special thank you to our education committee who helps organize these programs. And for today's program in particular, 2 committee members, or 3 actually, Margarita Jarabek, Danielle Campbell, and Marina Krustalova, who have all put work into organizing this program, and they're part of our education committee. So I just wanted to say thank you to them. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Marina now, and she's going to start with the first set of presentations.
Welcome, everyone. I'm very glad to greet all of you at our workshop on large-scale adaptive reuse projects. Today, we're going to see 2 very interesting and very different case studies. One is the Culver Students Project in Culver City, and it will be presented by Margarita Jarabek, Directing Historic Resources, Environmental Science Associates, Dick G. architect and project manager in Spectra Company, and David Kaplan, architect with KCK Architects. And also we will see another project, Broadway Trade Center in downtown Los Angeles, presented by two architects from Omgivnin Architectural Group, Sarah Grosbeck and Peter Reindelaud. And my name is Marina Krustaleva. I'm an architectural historian and historic preservation consultant living now in Los Angeles, originally from Moscow. And for the last several months, I was working on an article on adaptive reuse strategies in Los Angeles for this international magazine, My Livable City. And I want to briefly share my findings with you. For that, I'll have to share my screen. Give me a second. Full screen. Here we are. So this is the article, and the very first steps for adaptive reuse in Los Angeles started in 1982 when the Artist in Residence Code was adopted. This code allowed to convert former industrial buildings and warehouses into live and work quarters for creative people, for artists, and it triggered a large amount of conversions, starting from those big ones like our famous art brewery, which claims to be the biggest and longest living artistic cluster worldwide. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but they say so. But other projects were much smaller, like let's say this former lumber mill on Industrial Street in Los Angeles, which was occupied by 4 artists representing Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibition Collective. But these projects were adding up and contributing to the larger clusters, and finally forming what we know now as Art District in Los Angeles. And most of those projects didn't involve any investors or even architects and any large-scale conversion, but what happened there was a very low budget adaptive reuse. However, it was a great way to preserve these buildings and to give them new life and to revitalize neglected neighborhoods. The next step in Los Angeles was taken in 1999 when the city adopted adaptive reuse ordinance. And it was a well-prepared document. It was a result of a long series of discussions, including a lot of professionals, LA Conservancy, and several devoted architects, mainly from Killefer and Flamang Architects, KFA, prepared a very important document, which I was lucky to find out, to locate. So this document was a list of 50 historical buildings in Los Angeles and downtown LA, which were vacant at the moment. They were historically commercial buildings, banks and offices mainly, but they were evaluated as suitable for housing conversion. And according to Ken Bernstein, head of the Office of Historic Resources of the City of Los Angeles, within 5 years period, 80% of those buildings were converted and undergone adaptive reuse, which is a very impressive number. And up to now, I believe almost every building from this list is already converted. Downtown Center Building Investment Department reports that since 1999, over 20 years, almost 40,000 new units appeared in downtown LA, and a large share of these new units relates to historic buildings, not the new construction. In 2003, 5 other areas were added to downtown LA to be covered with adaptive reuse ordinance: Chinatown, Lincoln Heights, some certain parts of Hollywood, Wilshire Center and Koreatown, and some portions of Central Avenue development area. Here you can see several very important people who contributed to adaptive reuse in Los Angeles and who are responsible for really large-scale adaptive reuse projects. late Ira Yelin and still actively working Wayne Radkovich, Tom Gilmore, Isaac Shomov, Steve Nedelman, Yuval Barzemer, Barry Shai. Most of those people worked in downtown LA and Arts District. However, now we can see that some of them don't take any new adaptive reuse projects at all. Some of them switch their attention to new construction. And in a minute, I'll try to explain why is it happening. Here are several examples of very recent or ongoing adaptive reuse projects in the greater Los Angeles area, large-scale projects. On the top, you see Capitol Milling in Chinatown. This is one of the oldest industrial buildings in town. It dates back to the middle of the 19th century, and this adaptive reuse project was long awaited and widely covered in press. However, it seems that the works are over. It's all now finished, but it's still vacant and waiting for new occupants. It's a mixed-use project combining residential units and office spaces and retail. So hopefully we will see it occupied and living again soon. On the bottom, Ocean Center building in Long Beach was vacant for several years. The adaptive reuse project was developed there by Gray Architects for 74 apartments. There was a change of ownership, and only last year, the new owner, new developer Pacific 6, started the reconstruction. So it's on the way. Los Angeles County General Hospital on Boyle Heights, a huge 19-story building over 1 million square feet. There was a lot of discussion about converting it into the residential project for low-income and homeless people in Los Angeles. And to my understanding, the county is still looking for developers who could support the county in such an ambitious project. Even a bigger project, Sears Tower in Boyle Heights, was announced several years ago by Shomov Group, and in 2018 at one of the CPF's workshops, our speakers of today, Givnin Group, presented their very impressive project of converting this magnificent huge building into mixed-use development. Since then, the project was approved by the city, but the work didn't start. And as I know, it was published in newspapers. Isaac Shomov is looking for co-investors because the project turned to be too massive for one person. So here I'm getting to my concluding slides. What are the obstacles to large-scale adaptive reuse projects in Los Angeles now? So all developers and all architects working in this sphere, I had a chance to interview many of them. They mentioned that their real estate prices are just skyrocketing. 10 years ago, and especially 20 years ago, it was still affordable for many of them to invest, to buy a property and invest into the adaptive reuse project. Right now, everything what is remaining, especially in downtown LA, is too expensive and it's not feasible for them anymore. The latest seismic retrofit requirements are making large-scale adaptive reuse projects even more complicated than ever. So many formerly vacant buildings have been already converted, and again, it makes the remaining buildings more and more desirable and therefore more and more expensive. Then the adaptive reuse ordinance happens to have not only benefits but constraints. It's aimed to create more and more residential units, and especially affordable residential units. Leaves aside a large amount of buildings which are not suitable for housing. Let's say on Broadway, and we will see an example of this situation later today. Many buildings were created as department stores, warehouses, and their floor plans with very few windows and very deep floor plans are not really suitable for residential use, so they are not covered by the ordinance's incentives. And the last, but maybe the most important to my mind, is the lack of strategic vision on the city level. And the example of that is the Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. It's a big group of buildings, it's several blocks, and this institution has been in Pasadena for many decades. A couple of years ago, they announced that they want to build a new facility and they want to move to the city of Pomona. So it was widely discussed that all their property would be sold and it has to be redeveloped for some new use. And the institution and the city together, they were not able to develop any sort of strategy for such a change. And the city didn't want them to sell their property in just some small increments, and there were no developer who was interested in buying all the property altogether. And so this change never happened. The Fuller decided to stay in Pasadena, and maybe it was the best outcome. But this is just the example that when there is something on a large scale, there are so many stakeholders who have to get to a common decision that sometimes it's just not an easy process. So with that in mind, I want to invite Margarita Jarabek to start our first presentation on Culver Studios project in Culver City.
Okay, Margarita, I will be loading up the slides right now as we get going.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to present on the Culver Studios project, which is a large-scale preservation project. Let's see, I go to the next screen. How do I advance this?
Let me add remote control to you. Okay, now you should be able to control it.
So this project began with 2 environmental review processes. First, it was a specific plan called CPA 6 that looked at modernizing the studio and adding a few creative office. And during that review process, a historic assessment was undertaken. And then they decided to expand the development project to further upgrade the studio to current digital media standards, and also in anticipation of a new tenant coming in, Amazon. And so Amazon Studios is now occupying the site. So there was a big push to get a new project approved called the Innovation Plan that was prepared by Gensler. And I'm still not able to move the screen. As a result of that, ESA prepared an environmental impact report. We conducted a more in-depth historic investigation, and we worked with the owner, Hackman Capital, the Culver Studios, and Gensler to develop a strategy to redevelop the site, to upgrade the studios, and as well to conduct a large-scale historic preservation program, acknowledging the important history of the studios in the development of early film. So here's a picture on the left of the mansion building, which was built in 1918. It was the first major building on the site that has been preserved. Here's the front lawn, which has also been preserved. We did a landscape analysis documenting the historic landscape, and the landscape is being preserved as a part of this program. On it, there you go. Here's a view of the studio lot on the left, showing it's a long, narrow space up at the top, on the left, up at the top to the north is where the mansion is located. And then there's a spine that goes down the middle with the various sound stages along the spine. And so then to the right, top right, you can see a view to the north from a high spot towards the mansion with stages 2, 3, and 4 in the background. And I'm standing on building J, which is a new building, non-contributing, that was demolished recently for the new project. And then down below is a view to the south. And you could see to the right of the spine, the sound stages. The building O to the left of the spine is an old building, but it's altered. It's been made into offices over time, and it's no longer a sound stage. So, and then here's an early view of In Studios, the first studio there from 1918 to 1924, important during the silent film era. And in particular, you can note these glass stages. Of course, silent film, they had glass stages. Here's the mansion. And then to the next slide, let's see. So we did a chronology of the buildings that were built during this era. There's 4 buildings that remain, and the rest of the buildings are gone. One of the 4 buildings has been relocated. So let's go to the next slide. So this is the DeMille era, Cecil DeMille and the early RKO studios. This is when the Culver Studios became a part of the Big 8 motion picture studios, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is what it looked like in 1931. So in particular, the glass stages are now being replaced by sound stages. So sound stage 2, 3, 4, building O, and looks like there's 2 glass stages still remaining. So we're starting to replace the glass stages with sound stages during this period. Let's keep going. The next slide. So this shows from the RKO era, which is 25 to 35, which buildings are extant. Most of the historic buildings that are preserved today are the ones that were built during this era. And then there's other buildings that have been removed. So then there's the Selznick era, 1935 to 49. During this period, there wasn't a lot of construction or site development compared to the earlier periods. This is the period when the big productions came to Culver Studios, Gone with the Wind, Citizen Kane, The Paradigm Case. So it was historically significant during this period, but pretty much the historic buildings that contribute to the history of the studio site today had already been built, with the exception of Soundstage 15 and 16 that was added, which is down near the end of the lot. And then the additions to the mansion, which are this wing over here with building D. And then there's a DeMille theater that was added during the DeMille period right here. So this is building D in the DeMille theater here. So we have, go to the next slide. So again, here you could see which buildings are extant from this period and then which are no longer extant. So a lot of site development happened over the years. Let's go to the next slide. So the site was evaluated under the context of major motion picture studio, where we studied through comparison of the various major motion picture studios in LA and looking at Sanborn maps, what buildings comprised a major motion picture studio, and identified 12 building types that are associated with the studio as a property type. And today, there's 5 of the 12 building types existing on the Culver Studios lot. The site is currently dominated by sound stages and the mansion building. It's the mansion building and associated ancillary structures are colonial revival in style, and there's an intact landscape there. But the other buildings that formerly filled out the site have been demolished and replaced over the years. Next. Okay, so here there were obviously some integrity issues we identified on the site. So these areas outlined in red are the areas where buildings have gone from the buildings from the period of significance have all been demolished or substantially altered and are no longer contributing. So above here is a shot of the studio lot during the period of significance, and then down here below is a shot of the studio during the time of the survey. Okay, next slide. So we conducted the historic assessment. We identified and evaluated the building, the property under the major motion picture studio context, and also within the city of Culver City, the studio was found to be significant for the early development of the city, the early economic development of the city, and for the theme Heart of Screenland. In terms of the 5 building types, there are administration facilities, sound stages, talent facilities, which are the bungalows, a power house, and landscaping and circulation. The 40-acre back lot was sold off, unfortunately, and is no longer there. And then these other building types are no longer on the site. So it was identified eligible under criterion A1A, National Register Criterion A, California Register Criterion 1, for association with the Big 8 motion picture studios. It was eligible under criterion 2 for significance in the evolving film industry and economic development of the city. And the period of significance is 1918 to 1956. It's also eligible under criterion B, National Register Criterion B, and State Register Criterion 2 for its association with significant personages, Thomas Ince, Cecil DeMille, and David Selznick. And it's also unfortunately found ineligible for architecture under C3 because of the lack of integrity as an example of the major motion picture studio, because of the lack of the necessary property types. However, the buildings that are eligible there's 6 of them are designated landmark and significant structures, and also National Register eligible. 4 sound stages are National Register eligible, and the 4 bungalows, there's 4 bungalows, not 3. There's actually more than that. But anyway, 3 are locally eligible, E, H, and I, but we identified other additional bungalows that are eligible as well. So in terms of the environmental review process, which began in 2015 and carried on through 2017, there was a comprehensive plan amendment, which is a specific plan, which is a great tool to use for a large-scale project. The idea was to update and expand facilities while retaining the existing footprint of the studio and its historic character. It's a 14.3-acre campus. They wanted to sustainably adapt it to current and future needs of the entertainment industry. The sound stages are actually still valuable for use in the entertainment industry, but they also needed to upgrade the facilities to accommodate a digital media. They wanted to modernize the existing central area, which is the area where there's the lack of integrity. That was an opportunity for modernization there. They're adding 5 new media buildings with 8 media stages. And then 2 parking structures, 1 underground and 1 above ground. Unfortunately, the location, in terms of okay, let me go to the next slide. So I wanted to show you here, in this location is where the new parking structure, one of the new parking structures going, the Van Buren parking structure, and that's the location where these 4 bungalows, which are talent bungalows, were previously located, and they had to be moved in order to accommodate this parking structure. So we moved them over here. This whole area is being redeveloped, and there was a sound stage here that unfortunately got demolished, but we were able to keep the other sound stages here and keep all of the historic buildings over here. Next slide. So here's a view of the innovation plan. So mitigation measures, let's see, did I already show that or not? Go to the next slide. Yeah. So in terms of impacts and mitigation, significant unavoidable impact, first the demolition of stages 2, 3, and 4, relocation of bungalows, less than significant with mitigation, and then potential impacts for accessibility, structural, and security upgrades to the historic buildings. So how do we handle this? We recorded salvage and are interpreting stages 2, 3, 4, where we recorded the bungalows prior to relocation, and there's going to be an interpretive plaque at the new site. We prepared a relocation and rehabilitation plan for the bungalows relocation, and conducted monitoring during the relocation. The mansion landscape is being rehabilitated in conformance with the standards, and plan reviews and monitoring are being conducted. All of the tenant improvements and seismic and ADA and security upgrades are being conducted in conformance with the standards. And then in terms of the campus as a whole, there's a long-term preservation plan, not only short but long-term, for the future preservation of the studio, and then also an interpretive, sort of state-of-the-art interpretive program. So go to the next slide. I guess I'm done. So let's show the video. I wanted to show the video because it's a video short that was created by the Culver Studios, and it gives the sort of perspective of the owner as well as, and I'm in the video too. So it's a good overview of the site and the project.
Critical for us to try to get all the historical structures together in one location. So the bungalows wound up in the middle of the lot, and it wasn't the most efficient place, plus it didn't really bring out the historical significance. So we thought by connecting it to the existing mansion and bungalows at the front of the property, it would be a better location. We thought that's what made sense, what it used to be, and it sort of brought the history of the studio into focus. It was also important to move the bungalows so that we could begin the process of moving forward to modernize and innovate the studio. So it was an important step in the entire process for us, and a really meaningful one.
Well, I think it's extremely important to preserve the history of this studio. I mean, the fact that it has a history alone makes it valuable. There are stages in this town that don't. Thomas Ince is one of the founding fathers of film making in Southern California. But then you go on to Cecil B. DeMille, you go on to David Selznick, you go on to Desilu. I mean, E.T. was made here. Hogan's Heroes was made. There's stuff here that Ozzie and Harriet was made here. So this place does have a history, and I think that everybody who comes here enjoys that sense that they're kind of part of that history, and they're really continuing it forward. This place has a heart and a soul, and it has a history, and I think we all value that, and I think we should treasure it. This project was basically about moving 4 historic bungalows that were built in the late 30s. They were homes to Clark Gable and Vivian Lee, Olivia de Havilland, Gloria Swanson, and Orson Welles. I mean, that's all our history. And I think it's worth preserving, and it's worth keeping. And frankly, the tenants love it, that they're part of history, that they're really a continuation of what has gone on before. And I think just walking around here, they all get a sense of that, and they like it. And this could be a brand new studio. It would not be nearly as exciting. There's a certain value to the history that I think makes it worth preserving. So what we had to do is take off all of the structures that stick out of these buildings, because they're going to have to squeeze down this narrow little street. So porches had to come off, air conditioners came off of roofs, strip them down bare, cut out all the utilities, and there was a mess of pipes and conduits and all sorts of stuff going underneath these buildings. Disconnect them, basically. They slide these giant steel beams underneath them, and then they put these dollies underneath the steel beams, and they're going to slowly, they pull them, and they roll them down the streets. It's pretty amazing. But they squeezed them through this narrow little area. And I mean, there were inches to go when they were doing it. And at one point, they were kind of hitting, and like I said, there's no dry run for this. You just kind of go for it. But they're bringing the building up, and they're not quite clearing a concrete planter bed. So they have to jack the building up a few more inches in one direction so they can clear it and squeeze it down. These guys are great. These are the same guys that moved the space shuttle. They said they moved like a 50-foot concrete building in Pasadena. So, I mean, to them, this was kind of child's play and pretty simple.
These particular buildings have been associated with Culver Studios since the 20s and 30s. So their association is almost 100 years old. They're really important in maintaining the historic significance of the Culver Studios. We couldn't have picked a more difficult relocation project. And the reason I say that is because we're relocating the bungalows to the top of the parking structure. The weight of the bungalows combined with the rigging that's required to move them is too much for the parking structure. We have to be very precise about what we're doing and think everything through really carefully. We can't just move them and build a new foundation and hook the buildings up again. So, you know, the drainage is an issue, everything is an issue. So it's a very intricate project.
There was a lot of unknowns. We had to get the right team in place to find out what they were, give us enough time to actually make this happen. We've got the best team we can, but no one here has ever done this in its entirety. Everybody has done a piece of it, but no one has ever put buildings on top of a parking structure before. We've hired a specialist crew that have gone through and braced and secured the building to make sure that during the move it stays within its original parameters, doesn't shift around. We've removed elements from the building that would be problematic to travel. There was a couple of things that made the buildings too wide that we actually had to remove to fit through the access that we had.
I really appreciate and respect the time and energy that's going into doing the job right and really caring about the history and realizing that, you know, it's a win-win situation for the studios and for the benefit of the public as well.
We recognize when we bought it how unique the property was and its historical place, both within the community and at the city at large. So we felt like we needed to be a really good steward, and to be a good steward, it was important for us to preserve this as some form of, you know, content driving facility. And it's just such a cool property. At the end, it'll look great and it'll look simple, but all the hard work that went into it is quite remarkable.
Okay, now it's David Kaplan, it's your turn.
Okay, David, I'm going to, in a second here, minimize this and pass off control to you. So hopefully you're...
I want you to look at my screen.
Yeah, should give me a second here. Okay, David, see if you can grab control of my screen.
David, this is Marina. I believe we can spend 10 more minutes on Culver Studios, and then we have to switch to Broadway Trade Center. Thank you.
All right, we'll rush quickly. That was great film. I'm David Kaplan with Kaplan Chin Kaplan, and we are selected to be the architects for the relocation of the 4 bungalows and the adaptive reuse. Our firm's been involved over the years. The 2 gyms at UCLA, there's so many different ways you can do adaptive reuse. We assisted on the 2 gyms at UCLA. One became a student center, one became a dance center. The Armory building that became the Science Center School with Morphosis. Our own, we've relocated a fire station for the USC School of Cinematic Arts. and participating in all the great downtown stuff in a small way. The Arcade Theater, after being shut for 30 years, the offices in front, now that they're high rises, just to make them offices again is virtually its own adaptive reuse. So for this project, we were introduced, let's see, I'm having, let's see, advancing.
Oh, 1 second, David. That was my fault. I need to switch it over to presentation mode. So
Get off my phone.
Try that now.
Excellent. So this is our first visit with Margarita to the site. This is the setting. And let's see, I'm having trouble advancing again. I see I'm just rushing it, that's all. Some of the characteristics, let me get back to that. Somebody pushed this button so many times. There we go. There's the setting, some of the little characteristics. There were interior features as well. These started out really as just individuals being writers, and what it's slated for is to become offices for much more larger groups of people. And there you see circled is where the bungalows were relocated, as Margarita pointed out, the site plan. And of course, there it is. And just like you expect out of the entertainment industry, that green grass was misleading. So as soon as we started writing memos to the team about issues that we'd been encountering, and they informed us a lot. The site itself was part of a larger project. There was activities going on all at the same time. It's an active studio lot. The site turns out to be located over subterranean parking. There was issues about the soils. I'm advancing it without meaning to here. There were relocation issues, as the movie pointed out. There were, in the setting, we had to recreate a setting on an area where the landscape couldn't be as mature, but was starting over again. But we wanted to use the paths and paving. The schedule is a big part of it, as one of they pointed out, because once Amazon wanted to occupy the site. And so after one of the first tasks we did, sorry for skipping through all this, of course, the use became extensive, much more activity. There's huge mechanical and data that had to be included. The code, of course, was very important. Margarita pointed out the Secretary of Interior Standards, the State Historic Building Code we use. There are all sorts of accessibility handrails off those bungalow steps, door heights, widths, hardware. The house had residential bathrooms that weren't handicap accessible, fire life safety, sprinklers. Then putting it all back together with Spectra's help, reconstruction of all these finishes on the exterior, making choices about that with Margarita. The windows, reconstructing masonry fireplaces, extensive mock-ups and submittals. And then our team, all the additional side issues that come up, new exterior lighting, and the user brings in, and the owners had a lot of their own issues that they brought to the project that we had to incorporate. The team was huge. I don't know why we're skipping so far forward in these.
Let me check on this really quickly. I can advance it for you, David, if you'd like.
Okay, let's skip back. Yeah. All right. So there was the. I guess there's just such a. There was the first initial preparation of the buildings to be moved. It's taking advance, yes, etc. They're mounted up. One was slab on grade, so it had to be lifted from above the slab. The other three were bungalows. They were reached underneath, so all their skirts had to be removed, all the lower finishes. You saw all the relocation issues. When we got to the parking structure, they had to actually map out where all the structure was underneath. They had to shore the parking structure underneath. There's so much, just keep advancing. I don't seem to be controlling it here. They're showing the scraping it off. That's showing the structural layouts and how we had to adjust for landscape and placement of structure to actually meet. You want to go ahead? And so it's all mapped out as they moved in, and the trucks had to move away. There you see the shoring in the parking lot. Again, it was an active parking lot at the time. Go ahead. This was the crucial point, is how to get it sited so that you kept the same number of steps. That was partly an ADA issue. One building was slab on grade. So that was, you had to get that set just exactly right. And this was a key day. I had to record that moment. The steel getting steel beams out from underneath. Here they are adjusting everything into place. We can advance that. And you see the precision. There's a pneumatic machine up there on the top right. You can see how they were readjusting. As I tried to point out early on, the first task was to, of course, do elaborate. We did extensive as-builts and analysis and documentation of all the windows and openings for the project to maintain that. Then you can see some of the impacts. It's kind of scary along the way. A lot of finishes get removed in order to make these kinds of things happen. And then in the end, some decisions were made because of mix of finishes over the years and bad repairs that we're going to reconstruct some of the stucco finishes completely. And those are some of the decisions that had to be made along the way as we evaluated in the field. And here shows all the skirts being put back. Spectra was involved in all these projects, and that was a big part of having a cooperative team under a lot of pressure. Then the put back of various, the masonry fireplace rebuilt as, to maintain the massing, the interior spaces recreated, and feel free to advance. There shows all the data, the mechanical. We couldn't believe what mechanical systems they're putting into tiny bungalows in order to take care of now 15 or 20 people instead of 2 or 3. So that was something we had to figure out. Here's all the mock-ups, the dash coating. We had 2 different dashes, heavy and medium, depending on the buildings, and that was really done well. It's a lot of work. The paving was really an important aspect, getting that older look of worn cement. We went through lots of, there are moments of impatience, but in the end, the subcontractors come through for you. This is just showing, you're insulating, we took out walls that have been inadvertently placed through the middle of rooms. There are a few other miscellaneous improvements we were able to keep our eye on, conceal more mechanical. You see the interior finishes getting saved, the hardware. We had sprinkler systems for fire life safety, so some of that, the ceilings were heavily impacted. If you want to keep advancing, it's fine. The windows, the drainage was a big issue. We kept gutters off, but they planned for future. The owners always have their own intents or concerns, and so they avoided putting a bunch of the gutters on, but they asked for the right drainage in case they needed it later. You can keep going. This is one of my favorite shots because it really shows you it's the entertainment industry and you're recreating a set here almost. And then all the site infrastructure that had to go in, the paving work. Go ahead. And the sense of everything had to be built up. There's a lot of foam in there so that we brought the grade to at the same time we could only have 8 to 12 inches of dirt based on the, they're actually dirt specifications that provide weight. So it's just incredible all the small issues on this scale that come up. Then this is putting it all together. That's going to be the center space eventually. And of course, at the last minute, there's the mechanicals. By the way, we have so you have to learn to accommodate that. It got put into a trellis bungalow of its own not so great appearance, but it's disguised. Here we are finishing up. The fence was the original piece of the original fencing were retained and the rest replicated. And then the final grouping and product. And, it's just an incredible team, the proactive contractors and the owners who had good intentions and really wanted to do good things and had their own concerns. Somehow it all came together. So I think that's, and of course the contractors, we owe the best. I have to mention Tasmania as well, the general, and then Spectra, who provided all the labor for all the historic preservation work.
All right, thanks, David and Margarita. I'm Dick G. I'm the preservation architect and a project manager at Spectra Company. I apologize beforehand, but my landscaper just picked this second to show up. So if it gets loud in a few seconds, that's why. But our role on the project, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the construction issues. And John, I think same thing. I don't have control over the slides here.
Okay. Well, you can just let me know when to advance it.
Okay, so go ahead and advance. So I'm just going to focus quickly on some of the challenges of large-scale projects during construction. And so one of the things we always have is a fast-track schedule. I stopped short there of saying impossible, so it was almost impossible. But in all these projects, we always have challenges of keeping up, doing a lot in a short time. And one of the keys is having an experienced team and efficient project management. And on the next slide, you'll see that in addition to relocating the bungalows, we also had to seismically retrofit and rehabilitate the large mansion, as well as 4 other buildings on the historic buildings on the property as well. And so just to give you an idea on the schedule, we had to basically selectively remove, salvage, seismically retrofit, and get everything ready in about 3 to 3.5 months on 9 different buildings. And so you'll see some of these pictures of basically one of the things that it really takes is an experienced team that collaborates quickly and efficiently. And so this is an example of, we were given structural drawings, and basically if you let it run its course, you start construction, you identify issues, and you have to make changes. So from day one, the superintendent and myself took the structural drawings, walked through the buildings, and we identified all of the constructability and preservation issues while the design was fresh from the first day. And so, basically, chair transfer has to go through the whole building. And as you know, historic buildings, they don't exactly line up correctly, and it's impossible to get everything to work. And so basically, we were able to go through this process. We started with the initial design. We discovered all the issues, constructability and preservation. I realized that a lot of the double wall shear walls were removing more fabric than we really wanted. And so I worked with a structural engineer. We strategically one-sided shear walls. There were different planes happening, so we made them shear board, which is a metal shear wall versus plywood, so you don't have different changes in plane and historic materials. So we quickly identified and walked through and proposed these solutions. And what was great was that by the time that they circulated it and even got it to other members of the team, like Margarita, looking at the preservation issues, we had already identified preservation issues, and the engineer had redesigned about 90% of it before it even was routed over to them. So this whole process of getting the design, discover the issues, propose solutions, and redesign all happened within a 2-week period. So they were able to get new structural drawings back into the in the 2-week period. John, if you can go back one slide there. And so, and just real quickly, I think, one of the other things is just really having a construction team with preservation knowledge. And so we had so many people on this project. At one point, we had about 120 people from Spectra on the site. So you can see in that picture, it was definitely before social distancing. So we definitely could not do that today. But you have to have everybody on board that knows preservation, what to work around, how to incorporate these large amounts of intervention to be able to make this work quickly and without making mistakes. So, and then John, just to go ahead. And also with these large scale projects, there's greater intervention of historic fabric. So you have, a lot of times you have relocating historic structures. You have a large amount, as much as you want to mitigate it, to get a lot of the structural retrofit in, you have large amounts of selective removal and reinstallation. And so that involves a very careful and large scale removal, cataloging, and reinstallation. And if you go to the next slide. And so this is just an example from another project, since I had these slides already. It's a Crystal Cove State Beach cottages there. And so basically, to get all of this structure in, I mean, basically they had to do a hillside retaining wall, put new foundations under all 34 cottages. And so it involved a lot of removal and reinstallation. So you have to have a team that's capable of carefully removing thousands of pieces of historic material, cataloging them, storing them in containers, and putting them back and reinstalling them. And so in this next slide, you see that in Culver Studios, we had over 3,000 pieces of historic removal that we salvaged and removed. And so the end product you'll see on this next slide is that's the final product. The 4 bungalows relocated on the left, the big mansion that's rehabilitated, as well as the other buildings surrounding that had seismic retrofits as well. And then in the next one is the front view. We flew a drone over, so that's the front view of showing the mansion with the buildings, the historic cottages behind it. And finally, the last one is that in context of the whole innovation plan and the large scale new construction. So thank you, and that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're now going to move it over to our next case example here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Sarah and Peter, are you ready to share yours? And I'm also, oh, yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, Sarah and Peter, this is Marina. I think you can take about 25 minutes and we will have a little bit of time left for questions. If there are any questions unanswered, we would be able to answer them in written directly to people who asked those questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, CPF and John, for organizing this and inviting us to be here. My name is Peter Rindelhoff. I'm a project director at Omgivning Architects. On my right here is Sarah Grossbeck, project manager. Omgivning was founded roughly 10 years ago on the idea that the historic core of Los Angeles had a unbelievable library of great old buildings, and they warranted reuse and adaptive reuse and regeneration. So the office was formed around that idea. We've in the 10 years we've touched roughly 350 buildings in the Los Angeles area, mostly in the historic core, ranging from small mom and pop cafes to large adaptive reuse projects. And today we're going to talk about the Broadway Trade Center, which is one of the largest at 1.1 million square feet. Here's just a couple of shots of the range of projects that we're currently working on in downtown. When we talk about the Broadway Trade Center, I think there's an interesting parallel between the building and the historic core of Los Angeles, and really historic commercial centers nationwide. The building was first built in 1906 when Los Angeles was kind of just a dusty Western enclave. The city boomed up until 1929 at the stock market crash. Then you saw kind of a slow decline of many of the buildings in downtown Los Angeles to the period of roughly 80s, 90s, up until 1999, when the adaptive reuse ordinance kicked in, which Marina did a great job of kind of explaining the impact that had. It really kicked off a transformation of downtown Los Angeles. Started with residential work, and we've been seeing more on the commercial side in recent years. Now we have a daytime population of roughly 500,000 in downtown Los Angeles, and 80,000 residents. So you're starting to see this rebirth of downtown, which is really exciting to see and be a part of. When we look at Broadway in particular, I don't know how many of the guests today are local or how many have been to Los Angeles. or specifically to the historic core of downtown Los Angeles. If you haven't been, check it out. It's a really remarkable collection of pre-World War II commercial buildings. Many of them in a state of disrepair due to deferred maintenance. Ourselves, along with Spectra and many of the other contractors in the area, have been slowly taking part in kind of breaking that cycle of disrepair on these buildings, and we're excited to be a part of that transformation. When we look at the buildings, and Marina talked about the different types of adaptive reuse, there's certain types of buildings that lend themselves perhaps better than others to adaptive reuse. You have, and on Broadway in particular, you have a collection of theaters and office buildings, and in the case of the Broadway Trade Center, a department store. So each of those building types offers their unique challenges to the adaptive reuse of that particular building. And we'll talk specifically about the department store as one example. Here, the red box is the location of the Broadway Trade Center at 8th and Broadway, kind of anchoring the south end of that theater and commercial historic district. Here's a shot of the building in 1908. When it was first constructed, the Hamburger and Sons group, basically they took a collection of small mercantile shops and they brought them together in this one massive building that really kind of disrupted the retail norm in the area and really kicked off and shifted the center of the commercial core of the city just overnight, essentially. So this building was a really big deal at the time. There was, they say, 75,000 people attended the grand opening. Here you get, here's a rendering from A.F. Rosenheim, the architect, on the left, and then you've got an image on the right. Not sure what's happening here, but obviously very aspirational. So this building was really important addition to Los Angeles, and we've, over the course of the 5 years that we've been working on the project, have heard a lot of interesting stories from native Angelenos, their experiences in the building, you know, as children growing up and visiting, which is fun to be a part of.
So just a fun fact of the history of the building, you'll hear often that building had the first escalators, or as they were referred to at the time, moving stairways on the West Coast. So that drew in a lot of people just to experience that. And something else, I think, to give a good idea just of the scale of the project here, we have multiple phases of the construction kicking off, you know, over 100 years ago, and that photograph that Peter was showing was only this dark green portion in 1908, and that was large enough in and of itself. And then we had these other additions that came within a sort of a 20-year window, which was quite a considerable pace for such a large-scale project that just represents the growth of that building and that use. Here's an image just of one of the historic drawings of the building. This gives you an idea of that first building, just the complication and mass of it, and then you can imagine coming in with these other buildings right connected to it, and structurally how complicated that was at that time. And then these are some images just that depict, I think, the wide range of uses that were within the building. I have some of them here. Obviously, the typical department store uses with the sale of clothing and leather goods and housewares and jewelry and things of that nature. Perfumery, they were known for having a lot of laces and silks that you wouldn't see anywhere else. But also within that space, there were a myriad of other uses: a dentist office, beauty parlor, telegraph office, a barber shop, I don't even know.
Chiropodist.
Chiropodist, apparently it's what was at that time how they referred to a foot doctor. But then there was also a rooftop garden, auditorium, a theater where you might rest and watch a vaudeville show or one reel motion picture. They had very modern, what was at the time very modern soda water fountains. They also had a temporary location for the library, so the uses within this space are vast. There are some images of the rooftop uses. These photographs are from 1929, so that was once all of those portions of the building had been built. So you can see in these images where like these taller portions were part that were added later. Just an interesting something to note about these photographs is that all the occupancy that took place on top of the roof, and when we later went through all the processes to upgrade the building and argued for use, it was a massive structural upgrade required to do so. So the fact that all these people were on the roof of this building at one time was of little interest to the building department when you're going in and asking to reoccupy the roof.
Yeah, I think it helped on the photos. We were able to use the photos to prove rooftop use only from a planning standpoint, but not, as Sarah said, not from a structural standpoint and not necessarily from an exiting standpoint. Often with our work, the research that we do in identifying the original use is kind of the key to kind of mapping out the challenges of the reuse process and the permitting process. In this case, with that range, that broad range of existing uses, it really helped us out on this one. Here's a couple photographs of the project as we found it. We kind of consider this kind of the second life of the building from the 80s until 2015 when we first got started. This is my first memory of the building on my kind of self-guided walking tours of downtown. I'd often wander in here. They were pretty light on security, and you could kind of move through pretty freely. A lot of the historic elements of the building were kind of shrouded by the uses at the time. It was being used for garment manufacturing on the upper floors, and the ground floor was a swap meet. Very common uses for many of the buildings in downtown at the time. Here we are at the reimagined Broadway Trade Center. As I mentioned earlier, 1.1 million square feet. Think of it as kind of a mega mixed use building. And just as the department store was a collection of many different commercial sales areas, we kind of think of this as a collection of many uses that are in a way like a microcosm of the city. So the first floor, we imagine it as retail, restaurant, food market, bar elements. Floors 2 through 5, we're looking at that as creative office conversion. The 6th floor, social club. Floors 7 through 9, hotel uses. And then 2 rooftop components, which Sarah will get into a little bit more on the 7th floor. The 10th floor housing a broad range of amenity spaces and open spaces, which for anyone that's been into the historic core, you know that there's a serious lack of open space. So we see this rooftop as a kind of a critical piece to kind of completing the puzzle of a truly livable downtown Los Angeles. Here's a shot of the imagined ground floor storefront. Really, the majority of what you're looking at here has already been restored by Spectra, and we'll get into some of those detailed photographs. Our work on this exterior will be focused primarily on the storefront and converting from what was a series basically of display windows in the original incarnation to something that we envision as a little bit more porous, really linking the sidewalk uses to interior uses. Here's a first floor plan. Again, continuing that public sidewalk circulation element into the building, maintaining the historic display aisles as they traverse the building. That was a key component of the historic approval process. This project did seek historic tax credits, and we can get into some more of the detail on that one. The green elements are the primary elevator cores, which we've maintained. In the lower left-hand corner, you see this is a hotel lobby element with their unique and dedicated elevators associated with hotel use. Upper left-hand corner is loading dock and service functions. Here's a typical office floor plan. We managed to reuse actually all of the existing stairs. We were able to reuse. We did have to add one new stairway, but the exiting system was nice and distributed, so it worked to meet all the majority of the current exiting demands per the current code. So we looked at a typical office floor and we've imagined it from a range of potential tenant configurations. The project is a core and shell speculative creative office project. So our work is really limited to elevators, stairs, exterior shell, and rooftop components. Here's a quick shot of the social club at the 6th floor, and now Sarah will talk about the 7th floor rooftop.
Yeah, so this image actually shows the lower portion of the roof and then what would be the additional tower that is slated for hotel use. So on this lower roof, we've got a series of penthouses, some existing, some new, that would be various restaurant and bar uses. There's also a grove area here, a viewing area off to the north. There's various seating and dining areas throughout, and then on this northeast corner of the building that is slated for sort of a community park, and then a stage area that you'd be able to have different live shows and things of that nature. And then there's a very sizable pool over at this portion of the roof that would be more of a community pool. As we get to the upper roof, you'll see there's another one that would service the hotel. But the idea of this pool is that it would be more of a community use. And you'll notice in the center here, there's an entry that takes you to the 6th floor, which is slated as a social club, sort of a spa type amenity that could be shared for public use, and then also for the hotel as well. The 6th floor was posed an interesting challenge because what you have is essentially this area here that we've got this rooftop was part of that first initial construction, and the 6th floor was basically an attic space. And then as these other portions of the building got added on, those at the 6th floor are full height. It's like a full story. So portions of the 6th floor have really low head height. So there's a challenge there. You're already dealing with the challenge of the deep floor place, but at the 6th floor, just an additional challenge. And so ways that we looked at addressing that were tying the uses of that floor to the roof space. But as you can imagine, it's really slated for a really very specific tenant. And then moving up to the higher roof, as mentioned, there's another pool that would service the hotel. And then more penthouses. These are both new penthouses that function as bar restaurants. And then over here, tucked in the furthest corner, is some back of house, and then also the mechanical. Peter's going to talk a little bit more about the challenges of getting all the mechanical systems in this building, but being that we were trying to utilize the rooftop for so much public use, the idea is that the mechanical had to get kind of squeezed into that furthest corner. And then you'll notice some of these penthouses on the lower portion of the roof, we've got green roof there just because if you're enjoying yourself up on the 10th floor, you don't want to be looking down at just rooftop and mechanical equipment there. So every inch of this roof is valuable in some way to the project, and posed a lot of challenges in just how all those spaces would be experienced and what you're viewing from each space. This here shows an axonometric of that. I think it paints a little better picture of sort of the different layers of the rooftop and all the different uses and how those all overlap. And then this here is just an imagined view of how that space would be experienced. And I think the roof becomes sort of a common area or a shared space for all of the uses within the building, and poses its own challenge as far as the speculative tendency of that. I think Peter's going to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I think with the typical core and shell creative office project, we can focus on stairs, elevators, exterior shell. Your common amenity spaces are relatively minimal. This project was an exception to that, and here at the 7th floor, the 10th floor, and the ground floor all had extensive common spaces that had to be coordinated, permitted, and included in our typical core and shell. I'm gonna try to zip through this maybe as much as possible. John, feel free to cut me off if I know we want to try to keep some room for questions at the end. Here's back to the first floor. Another big challenge was just the kind of the overlapping and blurring of uses, which we think is key to helping to support a vibrant urban core. But it also creates challenges for office tenants that need to access the elevator core, and as they overlap market and retail functions. All of that has to be considered and really leased out simultaneously. An additional challenge here, due to the deep floor plate, over 300 feet by 300 feet, you get a sense of the limited natural light, which with a department store is not a problem at all. It's a very insular use. You want to focus on the product that you're purchasing. In the case of our needs, we wanted to create a light-filled office environment. So we opted, in order to try to solve that problem, we removed 55,000 square feet of floor plate in the form of 3 primary light courts and a handful of smaller skylights and light courts to really introduce as much natural light deep into those floor plates and into those lower floors as possible. Here you see a cross section of one of those light courts. I'll pass it to Sarah and she'll talk about seismic challenges.
Yeah, of which there are many, and I could go on and on, but I'll try to just quickly touch on, I guess 2 of the big parts of this. One, the seismic upgrade that was comprised of a series of 13 shear walls, and you can see that in this diagram here. Those shear walls are sort of banding together all these different pieces of the building as they were built over the years, and then of course expanding on that seismically. And then as those come up through the building, this image, it's a little hard to see, but because of all the additional rooftop uses, there's a whole nother set of structural challenges there. And the seismic upgrade was done in advance of all the other work. So here you've got all of the rebar coming through the roof that is intended to then later tie into all of what's happening up on the roof with the new pools and penthouses and things of that nature. And then here's just some images of that construction of the seismic shear walls. A very massive undertaking. And then this is just an image that I think shows here in the circle, this is just highlighting in just one small portion of that roof structural retrofit that will happen in order to get all the new uses up there. And then here's some of the detailing that is that entails in just this small portion. So the coordination for all of those uses on the roof is very complicated. Part of that just being, you know, the massive nature of it, but also dealing with these structures that are existing, and then having to like exit one historic penthouse and come out onto a new roof use, and coordinating those new structures and the levels and access. I think in total we've got new roof slabs, probably 20 plus at all different levels. So that was a massive amount of structural coordination.
Here's a view of a typical office. In pink you see a typical duct loop. In order to introduce enough air to these floors, we've got ducts that are up to 6 feet wide in places. The original building was not conditioned. The original ceiling was built just to the underside of the structure. So the idea of hiding any ductwork behind ceilings was a non-starter. We were able to maintain hard lid ceilings around the perimeter of the building and within the central core. And then within the center area, this area that doesn't have the hatch, the ceilings were removed really to provide room for the ducting. In addition, due to the historic constraints, we didn't want to introduce any new louvers to the perimeter of the building. We didn't want to tarnish any of the terracotta. So all of the air coming in and exhausting the building had to come through the rooftop area, which was a significant challenge in camouflaging all of those mechanical systems, which Sarah touched on the location of the primary equipment. In addition to the equipment, you have a series of exhaust areas and dog houses where air is moving in and out of the building. And here's a rendering of that rooftop, the intent being to basically not see any of the mechanical impact to that landscape.
This is John. I'm just going to jump in here and start with questions. But while I'm running through the first question, I would love the two of you to show us some of the images of the facade improvements and some of these other images you have at the end of the slide. And while I'm queuing up that question, you're welcome to sort of describe what you're showing, but I'm going to get these questions ready. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
This slide just touches on the range of permitting challenges: 16 building permits, 23 requests for modifications using the State Historic Building Code. It took the team 42 months for all approvals, 26 consultants on the team. As I mentioned earlier, Spectra led the restoration efforts, which are complete. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. Terracotta on all the primary facades, brick on secondary facades, beautiful wood double hung windows, all restored, and some replaced when the damage was beyond restoration. Also steel window restoration work also done. Here on the left of the screen, you see the original shop drawings from Gladding McBean. Spectra was able to track those down. The company is still in operation, and they had this phenomenal set of drawings describing each and every terracotta block. You'll see that arched entry there on the upper left-hand portion of the screen. We used that to try to recreate the original entry, which has been removed. And then on the right, you see some of just the detailed work of the terracotta. Walking that scaffolding and seeing those pieces in close up was really a highlight for many of us, to just see that level of detail. It's truly remarkable and really beautiful. When we move into the interior of the building, there's really a pretty limited amount of historic fabric remaining in the building, and it's limited to the elevator core at the center of the building, some of the escalators. You see some of this soffit work, which actually came in the 30s, but it was still considered part of the period of significance. So all of these elements, including the marble floor, these will all be restored and incorporated into office lobby components. And then when we move here, this is our last slide. This is kind of our latest efforts. We're in the process of describing the tenant criteria package. Again, because it's a speculative project, the work described in our permit doesn't describe all of the work that the tenants will be doing. So we've created a 40-page document that lays out the groundwork for the rules that they'll need to follow in order to maintain all the historic tax credits, including restoration of columns, column capitals where damaged. But all the perimeter window casing work has already been done by Spectra. But we've also defined a series of rules for how interior partitions, when tenants introduce new partitions, new conference rooms, new enclosed offices, how all those new elements will be built in a way that's secondary to the historic fabric and respects all of that historic fabric as much as possible. And that's the status of the project. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to dive right into questions, and if people would like to stay around for a little longer to address all questions, you're more than welcome to do that. We'll continue on with as many questions as we can get done until we're done here. But I'll start with the first question, which is, was this a certified, this is referring to the Culver Studios project, was this a certified rehab tax credit project? Oh.
No, it was not.
Okay. That's a great quick answer. So we can identify that answered as live answered. There are a number of questions that came into the Q&A box. I'm going to start with the first one. And this is an interesting question because it's sort of flipping usually I get the question in the opposite direction, which is how do adaptive reuse ordinances help? But it looks like this person is asking, what are the current constraints to adaptive reuse that are hindered by adaptive reuse ordinances, since most cities are embracing and encouraging adaptive reuse? Is there a hindrance or reason you shouldn't want an adaptive reuse ordinance?
Well, I believe this question appeared while I was talking, and I mentioned that there are certain constraints of this ordinance. So what I meant is that you can take more or less any building with any history, but under the adaptive reuse ordinance, you can get incentives only if you convert it in two types of new uses. It's residential units or a hotel. You cannot do anything else. So this is the constraint. I mean, you can do anything else, but in this case, you are not receiving any incentives and any streamlining of the process. But I believe that our presenters can have something to add to that.
Yeah, I agree, Marina. My understanding is the ordinance was written really to encourage residential use, and it did an excellent job of kind of injecting that use into the historic core, and it really triggered a lot of this wave of redevelopment. The second wave, which we're seeing, is more of an office and commercial need to complement the residential need, and that's where the adaptive reuse ordinance may not be helpful. We also have the Broadway Bulletin, we call it, which is more of a commercial document, which is similar to the adaptive reuse ordinance, and we use the state historic building code and the existing building code to try to help find exceptions. But as you touched on, there's so many challenges to reusing these existing buildings. We really need to find any incentives or any exceptions we can to try to make it viable.
As I know, the city of LA is really looking forward to extend their scope of adaptive reuse ordinance. They are looking for ways to do that, and practitioners like Omgivning are giving them all sorts of advice. But it's a very lengthy process, and we don't know when to expect this change.
Yeah, building and safety has a lot to do with some of the issues. They've gotten very tough on it.
Thank you. Yeah, my understanding is the Sears project that Marina mentioned was sort of hindered by the very stringent requirements for safety and health, and there wasn't really consideration for performance-based sort of requirements in terms of structural and some of these other things. So now moving into the next question is a question about integrity. Now, when you relocate a building, somebody's wondering how that affects the assessment of integrity, and does that ruin the integrity of those bungalows that you've moved, or what are your opinions on that?
So those bungalows were individually designated. So while the studio lot was not considered to be eligible for architecture, but still eligible for history, the individual buildings that were locally designated, which are all of the historic buildings in the historic area at the north area of the lot, were all individually designated, and some of them were designated for their American Colonial Revival architecture. But in any case, all of the designated buildings and all of the ones that we identified as eligible for the National Register, any of the changes had to, all of the preservation work had to conform with the Secretary of Interior standards. So when there were impacts to integrity through the relocation process, those impacts were, those potential impacts were identified in the rehabilitation plans that that David Kaplan prepared, and preservation standard preservation methods were used to avoid impacts, such as removing elements that would be impacted and then reinstalling them after relocation, or repair or replacement in kind where necessary. So the Secretary of Interior standards were followed thoroughly throughout the project in order to retain the integrity and eligibility of all of the historic resources.
Yeah, as you saw, the porches and various things that were removed were then reattached and maintained. I think that's one slide that slipped by. Mm-hmm. So much as the paving was all new, but the buildings themselves, we were able to hold on to much of the exterior.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to keep moving through questions. I know we're a little past time. Typically, I like to address as many as I'm able to, and I'm going to take these up thematically. Some questions have already been addressed by theme, but I wanted to talk about housing here. I think there were some questions about, in terms of adaptive reuse, should we make our priority to be housing? And maybe some people were wondering why, with the Broadway Trade Center project, why more housing wasn't included in that project. Were there limitations, constraints, requirements that prevented you from doing housing in that project?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's open for debate. As I tried to mention earlier, we try to look at each and every one of these buildings and try to identify what the most appropriate use is based on the structural system, the floor plate dimensions, all the exiting situation. And sometimes we'll study it residential, and it'll turn out to not make sense for residential, and we'll look at it from a completely different angle, from an office angle. In the case of the Broadway Trade Center, it really came down to the floor plate dimension, and in order to make that building work for residential, you would have to remove so much interior floor plate and likely historic fabric, and you'd have to give up the majority of that roofscape. I think would have to be given up in order to get adequate light into the building in order to create reasonable residential unit depths. So if you think of a typical loft or apartment building or condominium or whatever the housing type that you're talking about introducing, it can only be so deep. And so it's really limited by geometry in a way that office conversion maybe isn't as restrained by geometry.
Okay, thank you for that. And now there's a few questions about the landscapes, especially as it relates to the Culver Studios project. Now, when you were relocating those bungalows, how did you think of landscape and landscape design in that process? And did you have I'm sure you had a landscape architect or somebody consulting on this.
So the way that we handled the landscape was, first we documented the original landscape around the bungalows in place prior to their relocation. The landscape was documented in HABS recordation as well as laser scanning. One of the problems was that there were several mature trees that were part of the landscape, which obviously we couldn't recreate on the new site because we only had, I think about, I don't remember, 14 or 24, some small number of inches of depth of earth that we could put on top of the parking garage. So we tried to recreate the character of the paths, the orientation of the buildings to one another to keep the same relationship of the buildings and the spaces as much as possible. And then we looked at the historic landscape, the original one, and I identified the various species and the character of that landscape, and in addition to the paths and the plantings, also the fence that was originally there. And all of that was then, we recreated as much as we could in the new location. Of course, we were limited by the constraints of the earth, the depth of the earth. We tried to use foam to build up, for example, the sidewalks, and to try to reduce the amount of weight so that we could keep earth where it needed to be. And then we worked with a landscape architect to create an appropriate landscape. And it's starting to grow, and it's looking much better now. Was a bit bare in the photograph that you saw. But when people come to the site now, they feel like they don't even realize that the buildings have been relocated, and it looks to them like it's always been there. So I think that we were somewhat successful in creating an appropriate landscape. And of course, the landscape around the bungalows is differentiated from the landscape that was associated with the mansion. The rear landscape by the mansion is not the original landscape. It was altered by construction of the parking garage. So there was no integrity of landscape behind the mansion to begin with. So we had to look at historic photographs and try to sort of reconstruct the landscape, both in relation to the mansion itself as well as to the bungalows. So there's a bit of dichotomy there that we had to work out.
Great. Thank you. And now I'm going to very quickly mention to our speakers if they'd like to answer any of these questions by text or just typing in answers before we leave today, as I'm addressing one of the last few questions here. feel free to do so. You can just type in the answer either in the chat box or the Q&A box to address any of these questions that are unanswered. But I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now. The question was, you sort of alluded to it in your presentation, but I think they may want a bit more detail. How did you run into any challenges as far as the building or zoning code for the project?
Yeah, I can take that one. Okay. We could start with zoning code. Again, because we had existing floor area, more floor area than you would ever need. That's the first question. Second question is parking. If you're adding any floor area, does it trigger the need for parking? In our case, we were actually removing floor area, so parking wasn't an issue. Most of our planning challenges came from more of the restaurant and bar and those types of the food uses from kind of a CUP standpoint. We did try to introduce some new neighborhood functions, the dog daycare and a child care, which I believe that was part of our entitlement request. So on the planning side, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it wasn't necessarily as extensive as many of our other projects. On the building side, really, I think the biggest challenge was exiting, I would say, just the sheer number of people moving through the building and convincing our plan checker that everybody would be exiting the building in a safe manner, and all the exits were, arranged in a well dispersed way. I think there was some serious apprehension when we'd review our occupancy diagrams, and you'd see some of the numbers of people that are considered here are really pretty staggering. And I would say that was probably the biggest challenge.
Okay. Now, I'm going to encourage everybody to go to californiapreservation.org/e for evaluation and leave feedback on today's program. I'm going to close out the program now, but these questions that are remained unanswered, you can either address by email, or you can always email me at cpf@californiapreservation.org, and we'll send those to the speakers to address if they'd like to respond to you. I wanted to also say a very special thank you first to our speakers today who have volunteered their time, but also to our education committee members who have organized this program and made it possible. And finally, if Chris would like to say anything about our future programs, or if you want me to say that, I'm happy to sort of go over those quickly as people are going to the evaluation page. So basically,
thanks, John. I'm so glad to see all of you here today, and make sure you go to our website because we are announcing a lot of new programs on Monday.
Yes, and we do have a program on Monday with the three of us, CPF staff, talking about the really exciting upcoming programs. There's going to be a lot of archival material that we're going to pull out, and you'll be able to watch for free at no cost. And then also some information on our upcoming conference that we haven't yet publicly talked about, but we will be giving you updates very soon about our annual conference, which was planned for May of this year. So keep an eye out on our website. And thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate your registration and your support. Look into membership. And with that being said, I'm going to leave the windows open. Our speakers are allowed to, feel free to leave for the speakers, but I will leave my window open so people can continue to visit the evaluation page. And if they'd like to email us, just let us know if you have any additional questions about today's program. So I just pasted the evaluation link into the chat box. And thank you all again, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.